Hey guys, it's me. I'm back. I'm really sorry that it's taken me so long. I've just been so busy. But now that the world has kind of come to a stop, I thought it would be a great time to upload a couple of videos for you while you're kind of hanging out at home and maybe a little bored by now. And so I was going to pick up with our book where we left off. We left off at chapter 9. It was such a long time ago. So you might want to go back and watch the videos again so that you're caught up. But basically, our character, Ulysses, the squirrel, he passed out. He got eaten up by a vacuum cleaner and he was resuscitated. He was brought back to life by this character named Flora. And he was very excited to see Flora in this last chapter that we read. And it ended with the sentence that he was very hungry. And I told you that the next time we would read together, that it would be my favorite part of the book. And this is definitely one of those sections of the book that is very memorable. So let's dive in. Chapter 10, Squirrel Smuggling. Flora's mother was in the kitchen. She was typing. She wrote on an old typewriter, and when she pounded the keys, the kitchen table shook, and the plates on the shelves rattled, and the silverware in the drawers cried out in a metallic kind of alarm. Flora had decided that this was part of the reason her parents had divorced. Not the noise of the writing, but the writing itself, specifically the writing of romance. Flora's father had said, "I think that your mother is so in love with her books about love that she doesn't love me anymore." And her mother had said, "Ha, your father is so far off in left field that he wouldn't recognize love if it stood up in his soup and sang." Flora had a hard time imagining what love would be doing, standing in a bowl of soup and singing. But these were the kind of idiotic words her parents spoke, and they said the words to each other, even though they were pretending that they were talking to Flora. It was all very annoying. "What are you doing?" her mother said to Flora. She was sucking on a pitcher pop. It made her words sound rocky and sharp-edged. Her mother used to smoke. Not a good thing. And then she stopped, but she still had to have something in her mouth when she typed, so she consumed or ate a lot of pitcher pops. This one was orange flavored. Flora could smell it. Okay, so I want you to stop for a minute. I want you to picture that you have just unwrapped a blow pop or a Tootsie Pop, and those really big suckers, and you put it in your mouth, okay? So you've got it kind of hanging out over here, and can you feel it like kind of rattling around on your teeth? That's the sound that the author is trying to get you to picture, okay? So Flora's mom has got this big sucker in her mouth, and it's rattling around, and she's got all this typewriter noise, so there's just kind of a lot of weird noises going on in this house right now. So Flora's mom asked her, "What are you doing?" "Oh, nothing," said Flora. She glanced at the squirrel in her arms. "Good," said her mother. She whacked the carriage return on the typewriter without looking up. She kept typing. "Are you still standing there?" her mother said again. She typed some more words. She hit the carriage return again. "I'm on a deadline here. It's hard to concentrate with you standing over me breathing like that." "I could stop breathing," said Flora. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," said her mother. "Go upstairs and wash your hands. We're going to eat soon." "Okay," said Flora. She walked past her mother and into the living room, still carrying Ulysses in the crook of her arm. It didn't seem possible, but it was true. She had smuggled a squirrel into the house, and she had done it right under her mother's nose, or behind her back, or something. In the living room, at the base of the stairs, the little shepherdess lamp was waiting, a pink-cheeked smirk plastered on her face. Flora hated the little shepherdess. Her mother had bought the lamp with her first royalty check from her first book, On Feathered Wings of Joy, which was the stupidest title for a book that Flora had ever heard in her life. Okay, stop. There's this lamp in the house, and it's a shepherdess lamp. Now, you should know what a shepherd is. A shepherd is somebody that has a staff and they go around, they keep the sheep safe. But a shepherdess, like Little Bo Peep on Toy Story, is the female that keeps the sheep safe, okay? So, she's a shepherdess. She's pink-cheeked. Flora hates her. Her mother loves her. And she's somewhat important to the story. So, before we turn the page, we're going to show you a picture. And you'll notice her mom has got that sucker in her mouth. And did you see Flora and Ulysses? Her mother had sent away to London for that lamp. When it arrived, she unpacked it and plugged it in. And then she clapped her hands and said, "Oh, she's so beautiful. Isn't she beautiful? I love her with all my heart." Flora's mother never called Flora beautiful. She never said that she loved her with all of her heart. Luckily, Flora was a cynic and didn't care whether her mother loved her or not. "I think that I will call her Mary Ann," her mother had said. "Mary Ann," said Flora. "You're going to name a lamp?" "Mary Ann, shepherdess to the lost," said her mother. "Who's lost exactly?" said Flora. But her mother hadn't bothered to answer that question. "This," Flora said to the squirrel, "is the little shepherdess. Her name is Mary Ann. Unfortunately, she lives here too." The squirrel considered Mary Ann. Flora narrowed her eyes and stared at the lamp. She knew that it was ridiculous, but sometimes she felt as if Mary Ann knew something that she didn't know, that the little shepherdess was keeping some dark and terrible secret. "You stupid lamp," said Flora. "Mind your own business. Mind your sheep." Actually, there was just one sheep, a tiny lamb curled up at Mary Ann's pink slippered feet. Flora always wanted to say to the little shepherdess, "If you're such a great shepherdess, where are the rest of your sheep? Huh?" "We can just ignore her," said Flora to Ulysses. She turned away from the smug and glowing Mary Ann and climbed the stairs to her room, holding Ulysses gently, carefully, in her arms. He didn't glow, but he was surprisingly warm for someone so small. Chapter 11. A gigantic vat of incandesto. Now, a vat, and I can't remember if I've said this before or not, but I think it's important to remind you, a vat is like a really big barrel, okay? So it's a big, big barrel. Incandesto is the name of the soap that goes in this barrel, okay? And this is how Flora's favorite superhero came to life, by slipping into a barrel or a vat of incandesto. She put Ulysses down on her bed, and he looked even smaller sitting there in the bright overhead light. He also looked pretty bald. "Good grief," said Flora. The squirrel certainly didn't look very heroic, but then neither did the nearsighted, unassuming janitor, Alfred T. Slipper. Ulysses looked up at Flora, and then he looked down at his tail. He seemed relieved to see it. He lowered his nose and sniffed along the length of it. "I'm hoping that you can understand me," said Flora. The squirrel raised his head. He stared at her. "Wow," said Flora. "Okay, great. I can't understand you. And that's a small problem, but we'll figure out a way to communicate, okay? Nod at me if you understand what I'm saying, like this." Flora nodded, and Ulysses nodded back. Flora's heart leaped up high in her chest. I'm going to try and explain what happened to you, okay? Ulysses nodded his head very fast. And again, Flora's heart leaped up high inside of her in a hopeful and extremely uncynical kind of way. She closed her eyes. Don't hope, she told her heart. Do not hope, instead observe. Do not hope, instead observe was a piece of advice that appeared often in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. According to Terrible Things, hope sometimes got in the way of action. For instance, if you looked at your elderly Aunt Edith choking on a piece of steak from the all-you-can-eat buffet and you told yourself, man, I sure hope she's not choking, you would waste several valuable life-saving Heimlich maneuver-performing seconds. Do not hope, instead observe were words that Flora, as a cynic, had found useful in the extreme. She repeated them to herself a lot. Okay, said Flora. She opened her eyes. She looked at the squirrel. What happened is you got vacuumed. And because you got vacuumed, you might have powers. Ulysses gave her a questioning look. Do you know what a superhero is? The squirrel continued to stare at her. Right, said Flora. Of course you don't. A superhero is someone with special powers, and he uses those powers to fight the forces of darkness and evil, like Alfred T. Slipper, who is also Incandesto. Ulysses blinked several times in a nervous kind of way. Look, said Flora. She grabbed the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto off her desk. She pointed at Alfred in his janitor uniform. Give you a second to look at the pictures here. See if I can zoom in. There we go. You'll notice Flora's pointing at Alfred T. Slipper. And Ulysses is there trying to figure this out. What's a superhero? See, she said, this is Alfred, and he is an unassuming, nearsighted, stuttering janitor who works cleaning the multi-floor offices of the Poxatucket Life Insurance Company. He lives a quiet life in his studio apartment with only his parakeet Dolores for company. Ulysses looked down at the picture of Alfred and then up at Flora. Okay, said Flora. So one day Alfred takes a tour of the Incandesto cleaning solution factory and he slips, Alfred T. Slipper, get it, into a gigantic vat of Incandesto, and it changes him. And so now, when there is a great crisis, when maleficence, that's evil, is apparent, Alfred turns himself into... flipped through the pages of the comic and stopped at the panel that showed the glowing, powerful Incandesto. Incandesto, she said, see? Alfred T. Slipper becomes a righteous pillar of light so painfully bright that the most heinous villain trembles before him and confesses. Incandesto, she said, see? Alfred T. Slipper becomes a righteous pillar of light so painfully bright that the most heinous villain trembles before him and confesses. Sorry, I read that again, but that's okay. We're going to keep going. Flora realized that she was shouting just the tiniest bit. She looked down at Ulysses. His eyes were enormous in his small face. Flora tried to sound calm and reasonable. She lowered her voice. As Incandesto, she said, Alfred sheds light into the darkest corners of the universe. He can fly. Also, he visits the elderly. And that's what a superhero is. And I think you might be one too. At least, I think you have powers. So far, all we know about you is that you're really strong. Ulysses nodded. He puffed out his chest. Flora, her mother shouted, get down here. Dinner is ready. But what else can you do? Said Flora to the squirrel. And if you truly are a superhero, how will you fight evil? Ulysses furrowed his brow. Flora bent down. She put her face close to his. Think about it, she said. Imagine what we might be able to do. Flora Belle, her mother shouted. I can hear you up there talking to yourself. You shouldn't talk to yourself. People will hear you and think you're strange. I'm not talking to myself, Flora shouted. Well, then with whom are you speaking? A squirrel. There was a long silence from down below. And then her mother shouted, That's not funny, Flora Belle. Get down here right now. Chapter 12, The Forces of Evil. When Flora came back upstairs after dinner, she found Ulysses curled up in a tight little ball, sleeping on her pillow. She put out her hand and touched his forehead with one finger. His eyes twitched, but they didn't open. She picked up the pillow and moved it carefully to the foot of the bed. She changed to her pajamas, lay down, and imagined the words, a superhero squirrel rested at her feet, and so she was not lonely at all, emblazoned on the ceiling above her. That's exactly right, she said. Before the divorce, before her father had moved out of the house and into an apartment, he had often sat beside her at night and read aloud to her from The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. It was his favorite comic. It always cheered him up to read about Alfred T. Slipper and Dolores. Her father did an excellent parakeet imitation. Holy Bagumba, he would say in the voice of Dolores. Wholly unanticipated occurrences. Wholly unanticipated occurrences were what Dolores the parakeet would say when something truly unexpected and unbelievable was happening, which was basically all the time. Life was pretty exciting when you were Incandesto's parakeet. Flora sat up and looked down at the sleeping squirrel. Wholly unanticipated occurrences, she said. It sounded better when her father said it. Not that he said it these days. He didn't say much of anything anymore. Her father had always been a sad, quiet man, but since the divorce, he had become even sadder and quieter, which was fine with Flora, really. Cynics don't like a lot of chatter. Besides, Alfred T. Slipper was a quiet man, too. For instance, when he was on his tour of the Incandesto manufacturing facility and had fallen into the vat of Incandesto, he hadn't said a single word. Not even, oops. Words had appeared above his head, however, and Flora's father could read those words to her so many times that she could recite them by heart. He is an unassuming janitor, but he will dare to battle the darkness of the universe. Do you doubt him? Do not. Alfred T. Slipper will live to fight the forces of evil. He will become known to the world as Incandesto. Flora lay back down. If the squirrel were in a comic, she thought, what words would have appeared in the space over his head when he was sucked into the vacuum cleaner? He is an unassuming squirrel. Yep. But he will soon conquer villains of all stripes. He will defend the defenseless and protect the weak. That sounded good, too. He will become known to the world as Ulysses. Holy Bacumba. Anything could happen. Together, she and Ulysses could change the world. Or something. Do not hope. Instead, observe, Flora whispered to calm herself down. Just observe the squirrel. And then she fell asleep. Okay, readers, I want to stop for just 2 little seconds here before we read the last chapter for this section. But I want to show you the author likes to use different font. Now, font is the way that a letter looks in a book. So it's the way it's written. And so the author, our author, Kate D. Camillo, she uses different font in this book to help tell the story. So you'll notice I'll say things like The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. And it's written like this, right just above, actually, my finger. Okay. And if there's words that appear that are floating in the sky, like a speech bubble, and she thinks that she's like seeing words floating in the sky, it will look like this. And so that's why sometimes I'll change my voice so that you can know and hear. But I encourage you to get your own copy of this book because it's really neat to read it yourself because you pick up on those little things. So I just wanted you to be aware of that sometimes authors will use different font to tell the story a little bit better. And she does a really good job of doing that in this book. So, chapter 13. The typewriter. He woke in darkness. His heart was beating very fast. Something had happened. What was it? He couldn't think. He was too hungry to think. He sat up and looked around the room. He was in bed, and Flora's feet were in his face. She was snoring. He could see the outline of her round head. He loved that head. But man, he was hungry. The door to the bedroom was open. Ulysses got off the pillow and went out of the room. He crept along the dark hallway. He went down the stairs and past the little shepherdess. The house was dark, but there was a light on in the kitchen. The kitchen! That was exactly where he needed to be. He put his nose up. He sniffed. He smelled something cheesy and wonderful. He ran through the living room and the dining room and into the kitchen. He climbed up on the counter. And there it was. A lone cheese puff perched on the counter. He ate it. It was delicious. Maybe there were more cheese puffs. He opened a cabinet, and yes, there was a big bag with the beautiful word Cheesemania written in golden script on the front of it. He ate until the bag was empty. And then he burped softly, gratefully. He looked around the kitchen. Something odd that caught me here is that he could read the words on the bag of cheese puffs. I kind of think that's pretty unusual for a squirrel. Here's the pictures. Okay, I'm going to show you really quickly. So you're going to want to look here. This is part of our sequencing. Okay, so we're going to look here, and then you're going to come over here, and then look here, and then down here, and over here. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, here you go. Oh dear. What is our little friend gonna do next? Here we go again. You go 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. What is he doing? Ulysses. He's so proud of himself. In the darkened kitchen, the unassuming squirrel worked slowly. His whiskers trembled. His heart sang. He was fighting. Was he fighting evil? Who could say? Chapter 14. So we're going to read this chapter, and then we're going to stop, and I'll start a new section, okay? So chapter 14. Squirtle. Flora Belle Buckman, get down here right now. Don't call me Flora Belle, Flora muttered. She opened her eyes. The room was bright with sunlight. She had been dreaming something wonderful. What was it? She had been dreaming about a squirrel. In her dream, he was flying with his legs straight out in front of him and his tail straight out behind. He was a squirrel on his way to save someone. He looked supremely, magnificently heroic. Flora sat up and looked down at her feet. There was Ulysses, sleeping on the pillow, and he did look heroic. In fact, he was glowing, just like Incandesto, except oranger. He was extremely orange. What the heck? Said Flora. She leaned over Ulysses and reached out a finger to touch his ear. She held the finger up to the light. Cheese. He was covered in cheese dust. Uh-oh, said Flora. Flora! Her mother shouted. I'm not kidding. Get down here right now. Flora went down the stairs and past Mary Ann, whose cheeks were glowing a healthy and disgusting pink. You stupid lamp, said Flora. Now, shouted Flora's mother. Flora broke into a trot. She found her mother standing in the kitchen in her bathrobe, staring at the typewriter. What's this? Her mother said. She pointed at the typewriter. That's your typewriter? Said Flora. She knew that her mother was absent-minded and preoccupied, but this was ridiculous. How could she not recognize her own typewriter? I know it's my typewriter, said her mother. I'm talking about the piece of paper in it. I'm talking about the words on the paper. Flora leaned forward. She squinted. She tried to make sense of the word typed at the top of the page. Squirtle. Squirtle? Said Flora out loud. She felt a surge of delight at the zippy idiocy of the word. It was almost as good a word as tootie. Keep reading, said her mother. Squirtle, said Flora again. I am Ulysses, born anew. Do you think that's funny? Said her mother. Not really, said Flora. Her heart was beating very fast in her chest. She felt dizzy. I have told you and told you to leave this typewriter alone, said her mother. I didn't, said Flora. What goes on here is a serious business, said her mother. I am a professional writer. I am under a deadline for this novel. There's no time for hijinks and tricks. Plus, you ate a whole bag of cheese puffs. I did not, said Flora. Her mother pointed to an empty Cheesemania bag on the counter, and then she pointed at the typewriter. Flora's mother liked to point at things. You left cheese dust all over the typewriter. That's disrespectful, and you simply cannot eat a whole bag of cheese puffs. It's not healthy. You'll become stout. I didn't, said Flora. But then another wave of dizziness came over her. The squirrel could type. Wholly unanticipated occurrences. I'm sorry, said Flora in a small voice. Well, said her mother. She raised her finger. She was obviously getting ready to point at something again. Fortunately, the doorbell rang. So we're going to stop there, and I will pick up and start the next section. Yeah, the doorbell rang. I wonder who it could be. And who would have thought that a little bitty squirrel could write poetry and could manage to eat an entire bag of cheese puffs? See you next time.